Before anything was taken, before anything was questioned, the town existed with a certainty that felt permanent, grounded in a rhythm that did not need to announce itself to be understood, because every movement within it carried meaning, every step aligned with purpose, and every structure stood as proof that something deliberate had been built and sustained over time. I'd like to welcome you to the Veil of Forgotten Bloodline. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. You're part of something meaningful here, and we'd be honored to have you with us as we uncover more. Tell us where you're watching from. It helps us see how far these stories are traveling and how strong this family is becoming. You're not just a viewer here, you're part of the story. Let's proceed. The streets moved from dawn to dusk with a steady flow of life, not chaotic, not rushed, but organized in a way that reflected ownership. As wooden storefronts opened to the morning light and welcomed people who were not strangers but part of a shared system where familiarity replaced distance and trust replaced uncertainty. And within that system, children moved along the edges of the roads with energy that did not echo but settled into the environment as part of its identity, while older figures observed from porches and shaded corners with quiet awareness, not watching out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because they had seen this pattern before and had helped shape it into what it had become. Nothing in the structure of the town suggested fragility, because it had not been formed by chance but by intention, with each building placed in alignment with purpose and each space holding meaning beyond its physical presence. As churches stood not only as places of gathering, but as anchors that reinforced continuity through repetition and shared memory. And schools carried forward the weight of the future, preparing generations not only with knowledge, but with the understanding that they belonged to something that extended beyond their immediate lives, while businesses operated within a closed cycle that strengthened the town from within, ensuring that what was earned circulated through the same streets, reinforcing the same structures, building a network that did not depend on outside validation to function. Men moved with direction, their labor visible in the condition of the town itself, while women shaped the environment with a presence that was steady, consistent, and foundational, influencing the structure in ways that were not always recorded but always felt. And together they formed a system that sustained itself through alignment, through repetition, through shared effort that did not need to be explained, because it was lived. The town existed within boundaries that were understood rather than enforced, spaces that defined where its influence held strongest. And beyond those edges, the world operated differently, under systems that did not fully recognize or support what had been built here. Yet within those boundaries there remained a sense of control, of ownership, that did not require defense because it had already been established through presence and continuity. Trade moved through the town with quiet efficiency, each exchange reinforcing a cycle that ensured survival and growth. As goods passed from one hand to another within a network built on proximity and trust, where transactions carried more than value, they carried reinforcement, strengthening the internal structure that allowed the town to exist independently, without excess, but with enough to build, enough to expand. And it did expand, not through sudden change but through gradual addition, as new structures emerged alongside old ones, aligning with what had already been established rather than disrupting it, and pathways widened naturally through repeated use, shaped not by design alone but by movement, by presence, by continuity. There was pride within the town, though it was not expressed loudly. It existed in the way buildings were maintained, in the way streets were kept, in the posture of those who moved through them with quiet confidence, carrying the understanding that what had been built here was not given but created, and that creation carried weight, yet beyond the visible strength of the town. Something else existed, not within its core but at its edges, subtle, distant, and not immediately disruptive, but present enough to create a tension that lingered just beyond awareness, a tension that did not enter openly but remained positioned outside, waiting within systems that did not fully align with what had been established here. At first, that presence did not interfere. and the town continued within its established rhythm, sustaining itself through internal strength. But small shifts began to appear, not dramatic, not immediate, but enough to be noticed in quiet moments, as delays replaced ease in certain exchanges, as access to resources required additional steps where none had existed before, and as changes in language, in policy, in structure began to influence movement in ways that were not fully explained but gradually felt. These changes did not break the town, they were absorbed, adjusted to, worked around by people who had built resilience into the very structure of their lives. And so the church bells continued to ring, marking time with the same consistency as before. The schools continued to open, carrying forward the next generation without interruption, and the businesses remained active, maintaining the cycle that had sustained them from the beginning. From within, nothing appeared drastically different, but beyond the boundaries of the town, decisions were being made in spaces that did not share its continuity, in rooms where the land was measured differently, where ownership was defined through systems that did not account for presence or history in the same way. And these decisions began to move inward, not as confrontation but as procedure, as adjustments that appeared routine but carried deeper implications. As policies shifted, boundaries were redefined, and requirements introduced themselves into the structure of the town in ways that seemed manageable on their own, but when combined, began to reshape the environment. Still, the town remained, adapting as it always had, reinforcing what it could, maintaining its rhythm, continuing forward through effort and alignment. But the pressure did not remain constant. It increased gradually, steadily, in ways that did not demand immediate reaction but accumulated over time, altering the foundation without visibly disrupting the surface, and the flow of goods slowed slightly. Access became less certain. Land began to exist within frameworks that were no longer fully controlled by those who lived on it. And while the streets still carried movement, and the buildings still stood, and the people still moved with purpose, something beneath that continuity had begun to shift, not in what could be seen, but in what was beginning to take hold. And as the moment settles into this balance between what exists and what is pressing against it, one realization begins to form with quiet certainty. This was never only about what had been built, it was about what surrounded it. And what surrounds something long enough does not remain outside forever. The change did not arrive with noise or declaration. It settled in quietly, threading itself through the structure of the town in ways that were almost indistinguishable from routine at first. Because nothing outwardly collapsed, nothing visibly broke, and yet the rhythm that had once moved with certainty began to encounter resistance that could not always be explained. As transactions that once flowed with ease required additional steps, approvals that had never been necessary began to appear, and access that had once been assumed became something that now had to be justified. The town continued to function, its streets still active, its businesses still open, its people still moving with purpose, but beneath that continuity a subtle shift had taken hold. One that did not demand attention immediately, but altered the way everything connected over time. The systems beyond the town's boundaries had begun to press inward, not through confrontation but through structure, through policies that appeared neutral but operated with precision, through regulations that did not name their target, yet consistently affected the same spaces, and through decisions made elsewhere that began to shape what was possible within the town without ever needing to enter it directly. Land, which had once been understood through presence and continuity, began to exist within a different framework, one defined by documentation, by legal interpretation, by ownership that could be reassessed and reclassified without the involvement of those who lived upon it. And this shift did not remove the land immediately, it redefined it, placing it within a system where its security could no longer be assumed, but had to be defended, often within structures that were not designed to recognize the very continuity that had sustained it. Businesses began to feel the weight of these changes in ways that were gradual but cumulative. as supplies became harder to obtain through traditional channels, as external partnerships introduced conditions that had not existed before, and as financial systems once navigated with consistency began to impose barriers that slowed growth and strained stability. Not enough to shut anything down outright, but enough to create pressure that required constant adjustment. The town adapted as it always had, its people finding ways to sustain movement despite the constraints, reinforcing internal networks, supporting one another through shared effort, maintaining the cycle that had defined them. But adaptation does not remove pressure. It only redistributes it, and over time the weight began to settle in ways that could not be entirely offset. Institutions that had once stood as anchors began to encounter limitations that were not physical but structural, as schools faced restrictions in resources that altered their ability to function at the same level, as churches found their influence challenged not through opposition but through diminishing support systems, and as community spaces, once maintained through collective effort, required more than what could be sustained internally alone. The town remained intact, its form unchanged, its streets still carrying life. But the foundation beneath that life had begun to feel the strain of forces that did not need to be visible to be effective. Beyond the immediate environment, the systems that governed land and ownership continued to evolve, often without direct communication to those most affected, as new surveys were conducted, new maps drawn, new classifications introduced that reinterpreted the space not as it had been lived, but as it was recorded, and within those records the absence of formal recognition began to work against the very existence of the town, because what had been sustained through presence and continuity did not always translate into the language of documentation, and what could not be fully documented became vulnerable to redefinition. Roads were proposed, not as acts of removal but as developments of progress, their paths drawn across areas that did not appear significant within the frameworks being used. Yet those paths intersected with spaces that held meaning beyond what could be measured. And while the construction of such roads did not begin immediately, the plans themselves introduced a new layer of uncertainty, one that placed the town within a future that it did not fully control. The people continued their lives within this shifting environment, not retreating, not abandoning what had been built, but reinforcing it with the same determination that had created it, maintaining businesses, sustaining families, preserving institutions, and holding on to the rhythm that defined them. But the pressure did not recede. It deepened, extending into areas that had once remained untouched, as legal notices appeared where none had existed before, as claims were introduced that required response within systems that were difficult to navigate, and as time itself became a factor because delays, appeals, and processes stretched across periods that strained the ability to maintain stability. The town's boundaries, once understood through presence, began to blur within these new frameworks, not physically but in recognition, as what had been central became subject to external interpretation, and what had been secure became conditional. Still, from within, the town did not appear to collapse. Its buildings still stood, its streets still carried movement, its people still moved with purpose. But the continuity that had once felt unshakable now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, one that did not stop the present, but began to shape what the future could become. And as the scene settles into this moment of sustained pressure, where nothing has yet been taken but everything has begun to shift, one realization emerges with quiet clarity. Destruction does not always begin with force. It begins with structure, with systems that reshape without announcing themselves, with changes that do not remove immediately but weaken gradually. And by the time the impact becomes visible, the process has already been in motion long enough to be difficult to reverse. The breaking point did not arrive all at once, and when it did, it was not always recognized as a single moment, because by the time the first visible signs appeared, the town had already been altered in ways that could not be easily undone. And what followed did not feel like a sudden collapse, but like a sequence of events that had been set in motion long before anyone could name them. As the pressure that had once remained at the edges began to move inward with greater force, no longer subtle, no longer distant, but present in ways that demanded response. In some places, that presence arrived abruptly, without warning. As violence tore through spaces that had once carried stability, disrupting the rhythm in a way that could not be absorbed or adjusted to. As buildings that had stood for years were reduced in moments, their structure unable to withstand the intensity of what had been directed toward them, and the people who had sustained those spaces were forced into movement, not by choice but by necessity. Their connection to the land severed not through negotiation, but through immediate displacement. In other places, the breaking point did not come through a single act but through accumulation, through the steady continuation of the pressures that had been building, until the structure of the town could no longer maintain itself under the weight. As businesses closed, not because they failed internally, but because the systems surrounding them had made their operation unsustainable. As land was claimed through legal processes that did not require physical confrontation, but resulted in the same outcome, and as institutions that had once anchored the community lost the ability to function within the new constraints imposed upon them, the town, which had once operated as a unified system, began to fragment, not entirely at first, but enough to disrupt the continuity that had defined it. As families moved, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, seeking spaces where stability could still be found, though often without the same connection that had existed before. And as those movements increased, the network that had sustained the town weakened, not through lack of effort, but through the loss of proximity. Because what had been built relied not only on shared purpose but on shared space. The streets that had once carried steady movement began to change, not empty but altered, their rhythm no longer aligned with what it had been. As certain storefronts remained closed longer than expected, as repairs that would once have been immediate were delayed or left incomplete, and as the visible signs of strain began to accumulate in ways that could not be ignored. Beyond the town, the systems that had applied pressure continued to operate with consistency, their outcomes aligning with what had been set in motion as land was reclassified, ownership transferred, and development plans moved forward with a certainty that did not require acknowledgement of what had existed before. And within those plans, the town was no longer central. It was an obstacle to be removed, not always through direct action, but through the continuation of processes that made its existence increasingly difficult to sustain. Those who remained within the town continued to resist in the ways available to them, maintaining what they could, holding on to structures that still stood, reinforcing connections that had not yet been broken. But resistance within a system that does not recognize it does not always alter the outcome. And over time the balance shifted further. As the effort required to sustain the town exceeded what could be maintained under the conditions imposed upon it, the breaking point, when viewed in retrospect, does not appear as a single event, but as a threshold. A moment where continuation became unsustainable, where the alignment that had once held everything together could no longer counter the forces acting against it. And beyond that threshold, the town did not vanish instantly. It diminished, its presence reduced, its structure altered until what remained no longer reflected what had once existed. Buildings that had defined the town were removed, some through direct destruction, others through neglect that allowed them to fall into disrepair, their absence creating gaps that were quickly filled by new developments that did not carry the same history. And as these changes continued, the physical landscape began to transform, not entirely erasing what had been there, but covering it, redefining it within a new framework that did not require memory to function. The people, displaced from the spaces they had sustained, carried with them fragments of what had been lost, stories that could not fully capture the structure that had once existed. Because that structure had depended on more than individual memory, it had depended on the collective presence that had now been disrupted and without that presence the continuity weakened further, leaving behind a version of the past that could be remembered but not fully restored. The town, once defined by its completeness, now existed in parts, in what remained, in what had been moved, in what had been altered, and in what had been altered, and in what had been lost entirely. And as the scene settles into this phase of transformation, one realization becomes unavoidable. Destruction does not always appear as a single act. It can unfold through stages, through processes that weaken, fragment, and ultimately remove what once stood. And by the time the absence becomes visible, the structure that held everything together has already been taken apart piece by piece. What remains is not the destruction itself, but the absence it leaves behind, because by the time the process has completed, the visible signs of what once existed have been reduced to fragments, and in many cases removed entirely, replaced by structures that carry no immediate indication of what stood there before. As the land is redefined once more, not as a site of disruption, but as a space of continuation where roads stretch across former streets without interruption, where buildings rise where foundations once held something different, and where daily life resumes with a rhythm that does not reflect the history beneath it. The transformation is not marked by memory, but by function, as the new environment operates within its own logic, independent of what preceded it, and the absence of visible markers allows that independence to remain unquestioned, because what cannot be seen does not demand acknowledgement within the systems that now govern the space. The people who move through these areas do so without awareness of the layers beneath them, their presence aligned with the present rather than the past, and the ground itself, though unchanged in what it holds, exists within a narrative that no longer includes what it once contained, because the systems that define the present do not rely on the preservation of memory to maintain continuity. They rely on structure, on function, on the ability to operate without interruption. Yet memory does not disappear entirely, it persists in fragments, carried by those who remember, by those who heard stories that were not fully recorded, by those who attempt to trace what has been lost through incomplete records and shifting landscapes. And these efforts, though limited, reveal patterns that extend beyond a single location, connecting spaces that were once distinct but experienced similar processes of removal, suggesting that what occurred was not isolated but repeated, not always in the same form, but with the same outcome. The land, when disturbed again, occasionally reveals these hidden layers, as construction projects uncover traces that interrupt the present with evidence of the past, and each discovery carries the same brief moment of recognition, the same pause where the current narrative is challenged by what emerges from beneath it. Yet these moments do not always lead to full restoration. Often they result in documentation, in acknowledgement that is contained within reports and records, followed by a return to the processes that continue to shape the surface. The cycle persists not through intention alone, but through the alignment of systems that prioritize continuity over reflection, allowing development to move forward without fully integrating what lies beneath it. And in this way, the absence becomes normalized, not as something to be questioned, but as something that simply exists. The towns that once stood with structure, with rhythm, with continuity, are no longer present in their original form, their existence reduced to what can be remembered, to what can be partially reconstructed through fragments that remain, and to what is occasionally revealed when the ground is disturbed enough to answer. Yet even in absence, the pattern remains visible to those who look beyond the surface, because the repetition of these processes across different places, across different times, forms a continuity of its own, one that does not rely on physical structures to exist, but on the alignment of events that produce similar outcomes. And as the scene settles into the present, where the land appears complete, where the structures stand without interruption, where life continues with its own rhythm, the question that remains is not what has been lost, because that cannot be fully recovered, but how much of what once existed continues to lie beneath the surface, unacknowledged yet present, waiting not to be remembered, but to be uncovered again.